We're live.
Okay, we're live. Yes. So we are just going to wait a few moments here as our viewers will see the notification so people can click on to join us here. But I see a few people are already clicking on to join us. So welcome to our viewers who are joining us here. We are online with Will Schutt and Alan Frost. And as we just wait a moment for our audience to join us. I'll just mention that today's event is part of the Siena Art Institute's ongoing series of online talks, StARTers Live. On Tuesdays for the months of April and May, we've been focusing on the topic of art and education with a special focus on fostering creative and critical thinking. As always, we welcome our viewers to use the comment section of the broadcast to interact with us. So feel free to ask questions which we can try to respond to during the live stream. To briefly introduce today's speakers, Will Schutt and Alan Frost were some of the very first American students to study with our director, Miriam Guardanelli-Santi, here in Siena, and they both have gone on to lead very interesting careers. Will Schutt is a poet and translator. His book of poems, Westerly, received the 2012 Yale Series of Younger Poets competition, and his most recent translations include My Life, I Lapped It Up, selected poems of Edoardo Sanguinetti, which was published by Oberlin College Press in 2018, Atlantis by Carlo and Renzo Piano, which was published by Europa Editions in 2020, and Fleeing for Safety from Mantua to Switzerland by Corrado Vivanti and Clelia di Paragola, which was published by CPL Editions in 2020. He lectures at Goucher College, where he directs the Goucher College Young Writers Camp, and he's also the co-curator of Polychromia, the Siena Art Institute's Poetry and Translation Festival here in Siena. Alan Frost is the director of the Innovative Teacher Program at the Nueva School, which is a pre-K through 12 school for gifted students in the San Francisco Bay Area. He works with teachers across the school, helping them to grow their pedagogical practice, and he also teaches several humanities courses, including Rage, Romance, and Resilience, a cultural history of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and close readings in everyday life. Before Nueva, Alan received his PhD in English at Stanford University in 2015. His dissertation focused on representations of geography and space in 20th century American novels from William Faulkner to Jonathan Franzen. While pursuing his doctorate, Alan spent several summers teaching literary theory to high school students at the Arkansas Governor's School in his home state. He began his teaching career in public high schools in Pennsylvania and then taught at the Chinese International School in Hong Kong. And he received his BA in English Literature and Educational Studies from Swarthmore College. He currently lives in San Francisco, where he plays oboe in the San Francisco Philharmonic and the Bay Area Rainbow Symphony. So as more viewers are now joining us here, let me just once again thank you all for joining us today. We welcome our audience to use the comment section of this broadcast to ask questions, which we'll be very happy to try and respond to during the second part of this live stream. But for now, let's hear from our presenters who can give us a glimpse into how they spark critical and creative thinking in their teaching. So take it away, Alan.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's really nice to be here this morning here in California with you and Will, and I'm delighted to participate. So if we could go ahead and share the slides that I had prepared, that would be great. I wanted just to provide three brief examples of some of the work that I do with students. As a high school teacher of literature, I'm aware that not every student of mine will go on to be a literary scholar or certainly a writer. But what I'm trying to do is to have students engage authentically with literature in a way that actually sparks their own creativity. So a lot of the work that I'm doing tries to get away from traditional essays, though I do assign those too. Please don't get me wrong. And really, I'm trying to think about what ways can students respond authentically like an artist or like a professional in the arts to some of the works that we're reading. So here's a few examples very briefly, and happy to talk more about these later. it's a staple of American literature classes, even at my school, which is very non-traditional, to teach The Crucible, a play by Arthur Miller that is really about ostensibly the Salem witch trials in America in the late 17th century, but which actually Arthur Miller was writing in response to Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunts in the 1950s. And so we asked students as they're reading The Crucible, we thought, gosh, how can we have them be like a playwright, act like a playwright in responding, while also really wanting to understand the kind of satirical mechanisms, right, that Miller is using. So we asked students, you can just see here briefly, we asked students to really think about what is an episode in American history that you feel continues to resonate in the United States in 2017, and then students actually pitch an idea for a play, right, with a prose introduction like that at the beginning of The Crucible. So when we do this, I have students who have written about the Indian Removal Act, right, an act that happened under President Andrew Jackson in the 19th century, but the play is actually about that, although they're using that historical episode to actually critique the United States contemporary border policy at our Mexican border. Or another student who has written about, or the play that she pitched was about a woman who was a kind of healer among other women in the early United States. But actually that is a critique or a commentary on the limited access that many American women have to reproductive health care. So this is a way in which students are really responding to a play by being playwrights themselves, and we find that actually really energizes them. We'll go on to the next slide, please. And the next slide. Oh, do I need to do that? I'm sorry.
Yes, that's all right.
So another assignment we have students do that I helped create, really thinking about some classic American poets, right? Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, Thoreau, not a poet, and Frederick Douglass. And I wanted students to be able to respond to those texts by doing some original artwork. So we actually think about, we've asked students to think about what kind of visions, right, did those artists look at as they were creating their works? And how can students use their own artistic talent to respond in kind, in their own artistic ways to those 19th century American writers? And so some of the examples we've had, I took some pictures. This was a student who took a line from Walt Whitman from Song of Myself. The line was, "Nature without check with original energy." And she actually she woodcut this planter with that quote from the poem, and then planted grass to grow up through that, right? She then wrote a very lengthy artist statement, sort of talking about her process and how, for her, the line of poetry really was meant to be understood as something wild and living. Another student really thought about the kind of domestic interior landscape of Emily Dickinson, particularly the way that women's artistic pursuits were limited to the home and how Dickinson had transcended those. And she actually did some cross-stitching in response to Emily Dickinson's "Because I Could Not Stop for Death." And in this artist statement, I remember very well, those flowers are all kind of indicative of different kinds of emotions that the student felt that Dickinson might have experienced as a woman in the 19th century, confined largely to the home. And then finally, a student who's a graphic designer did this array, which he was inspired by men's fashion magazines, to think about what kinds of things would be in Walt Whitman's backpack, right? And so he did this kind of array, it's called, responding to Dickinson's kind of to Whitman's frontier poetry. The last assignment I want to talk about briefly is from a course that I teach called Rage, Romance, and Resilience, which is a cultural history of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the United States and indeed in the world. It's an interdisciplinary course that I have the pleasure to teach with our Director of Social Justice. And so we wanted students to really think about all they learned throughout the course, which involved film, visual art, activism, literary theory, in politics. And rather than saying, we're going to grade you like on an A to F scale, as very traditional in America, we said, we want you to take one of these 6 competencies. We use something called competency-based learning, and we want you to respond to one of those. So do something, make something that really is speaking to one of your passions that falls into one of these competencies, right? Understanding of self, activist art, connecting communities. You can see the other ones here. And what we got from students was an astonishingly personal, right, response to all they had learned and all they had encountered throughout the course. So you can see here, I just have a snapshot of some of the artifacts that they made. We had a student who wrote a nearly 100-page play. Really, that was that kind of activist art that spoke to his understanding. We had a student here in the middle, you can see the painting, who made paintings that were reflections of her own coming to terms with loss, with trauma, and with the history of sexuality in the United States. We had a student who created a zine, which was in the United States a very 1990s counterculture product, using the connecting communities competency. And then on the bottom right of this slide, you can see we had a student who actually went out into San Francisco, into the Castro district, the historically gay neighborhood in the Castro that had suffered losses of thousands of people from HIV/AIDS in the 80s and 90s. And she meticulously documented all the bars, restaurants, cafes, community spaces that had hosted people who passed away of AIDS, and which those spaces are now, something else, right? They're now like an exclusive high-end sandwich shop or a Starbucks. And she wanted to document those and make sure they were memorialized. So those are just some of the projects that I've done to spark student creativity. The idea, again, being that the creative work of the artist or of the author is merely a jumping off point for the student's own creativity. And so I'm happy to take questions, but for now, I will turn it over to Will.
Thank you, Alan. That was wonderful. And thank you again to Lisa and Miriam. I know you're out there listening. I feel a little bit funny talking about education. I teach intermittently, one semester on and one semester off, and I haven't been teaching this spring. I do write poems, as Lisa mentioned, and occasionally prose, and I translate poetry and prose. But I don't think of myself as an educator. That suggests a greater fixity of purpose, I think, than I possess. I guess teacher is okay. Teacher, I think, is a warmer word than educator. When I do teach, I teach at Goucher College, which is a small liberal arts college in Baltimore with a great writing program, and I teach creative writing, usually mixed genre, fiction, poetry, creative nonfiction, although I'm most interested in most at home in poetry and translation. So I thought we'd take a look at a poem and a translation, or an experiment in translation. But I'll talk a little bit broadly first. So Lisa, you just let me know. I think I'm already sharing, so we can throw up the...
We can go to the slides.
And I'll just open it up to make it big. Okay,
Perfect.
So everybody can see. I should say this is a simplification of what I consider a pretty messy and complicated process of the process of say making a poem or making any artwork. And I'm stealing this from a wonderful book called Habits of the Creative Mind, which is a book that is really focused on teaching college students how to creatively approach academic writing or critical writing. And I'm using this to talk about how to approach creative writing. And as I say, creativity in general and art in general. So there is in that book, Habits of the Creative Mind, there's this chapter that says that the 3 fundamental words in the English language are these 3 small words you see on your screen: and, but, and or. I think, as I say, that these get at the sort of both these 3 words, these 3 simple words, at how we're doing what we're doing, I mean, in creative writing classes, that's what we're talking mostly about, the craft. But they also get at what the effect of art is, and maybe a bit about the why. So I'll just go through these. And the word "and" suggests to me the business of drawing connections. Really, what we're doing often in making a poem, or you're putting two things together that haven't been put together before. And when you do that, you change them. Each thing put together changes the other and changes our perception of that thing. This can be on a craft level as simple as a noun and an adjective, putting together a noun and an adjective that haven't been put together before. Part of writing, and a writer's job is to dust off the old language, the trite, the cliche. But we can also think of "and" in terms of the making of a metaphor, which is really what a metaphor is. A metaphor is saying this is that other thing. Or if you're more tentative and you want to write a simile, you just want to say this is like that other thing. So I think also I've often talked to my students about, drawing connections between unlike things, not the obviously apparent, not the shop-worn phrase, and the more apparently unalike those two things are, usually yields the more promising possibilities. The word "but" is, I think, critical. "But" qualifies. And the qualifying impulse in art, I think, usually I tell my students it comes somewhere in the middle of the process. I usually think that in your first drafts, you should be wild. You should take risks. You should bring it to life, as Alan was suggesting. But then when you go back to a poem the next day, you start to interrogate whatever that metaphor is. How are they? Think about how they're unalike. Where your metaphor is breaking down. Sometimes, and I'm not saying that all metaphors break down, but that, and sometimes it's interesting to incorporate that into the creative act. The slippage, as a lot of poets call it. But in any case, so "but" is you're interrogating the work, and "or" for me speaks to the broader purposes of art. Not the how of making, but the why. It underscores the importance of reimagining the language, reimagining experience, or maybe reimagining certain artistic or literary traditions. Or means saying that it could be otherwise. We could go back to the way we lived before, or we could find some other way of living. We could build cities on this past model, or we could find another way of living together, of occupying space. When it comes to writing, it's often we could write a sonnet this way, but we could also reimagine it as something else. And a lot of what I'm doing in the classroom is showing how stories or poems have been written, and trying to encourage both myself and my students to think about how they could be written, how they could be otherwise. So I'm just going to show a poem that kind of represents this, or makes visible this idea of "and" and "or" thinking. And this is a poem by Les Murray, a wonderful Australian poet who passed away in 2019. It's a poem, so I ought to read it, I think. This is from a poem. It's just the opening. Beanstalks in any breeze are a slack church parade, without belief, saying trespass against us in unison. Recruits in mint Air Force Dacron with unbuttoned leaves. Upright with water like men, square in stem section, they grow to great lengths, drink rain, keel over all ways, kink down and grow up afresh with proffered new green stuff. Above the cat and mouse floor of a thin bean forest, snails hang wrapped in their food, ants hurry through several dimensions, spiders tense and sag like little black flags in their cordage. Going out to pick beans with the sun high as fence tops, you find plenty and fetch them. An hour or a cloud later, you find shirtfuls more. At every hour of daylight appear more than you missed, ripe, knobbly ones, freshy-sided, thin straight, thin crescent, frown-shaped, bird-shouldered, boat-keeled ones, beans knuckled and single-bulged, minute green dolphins et suck, beans upright like lecturing, outstretched like blessing fingers in the incident light, and more still, oblique to your notice, that the noon glare or cloud light or afternoon slants will uncover. Wonderful poem, rich poem, a poem of plenty and proliferation, I think, as you can hear. And I think that sense of plenty is created, again, by this sort of end thinking, the juxtaposition that's going on at the level of the language. Really, the title of the poem prepares us for that. The broad bean next to the sermon. The poem gains a lot of texture by combining religious language, liturgical language, sermons, and trespass against us, and blessing fingers with its sort of very earthy and modest subject, the broad bean. If there are Tuscans out there listening, this is, I think, the broad bean is what you call bacelli. Anyways, one interesting thing that I've done with students is, looking at a poem like this is how can you play with this high-low combo. Take, another means of juxtaposition is to take a modest subject and elevate it by using what we sometimes think of as a high register of language. The opposite works well too. Take a pretentious subject, take or a subject that seems quite grave or serious. Take the Madonna and Child, for instance, and bring it down to earth, the way that Les Murray does here. That kind of combination, I think, it has been yielded good stuff. I'll just show you one other, but I don't know what to call this. It's a text. This is just, again, the beginning of the text by Caroline Bergvall, a wonderful poet and I think she's French-Norwegian poet and artist. This is the beginning of what's called Via or Via, 48 Dante variations. And what she's done here, as you can see, is she's put these are the first 8, but she's put together 47 English translations of the opening stanza of the Divine Comedy. Well, again, I mean, that gets back to this notion of endness, of juxtaposition, taking these things out of their original context to make something new. But more significantly, it's a really fascinating project and an example of I like to think of as or thinking, encouraging us to reimagine what a translation is and what an original text is. She's taking a classic that we think we're all familiar with, the Divine Comedy, and showing it to us in an unfamiliar light. I just want to point out a few things about this. It's not just that she smashed these things up together, but some of, if we think critically about this a bit, some of the choices that she's made are quite interesting, in which they make us, I think Alan used the word the other day, provocations. They make us think about particular things. They ask questions. She doesn't put these translations of just these 3 opening lines in chronological order. You can see it's the first one's from 1996, the second one's from 1989, then we jump back to 1893. And one thing that makes me think of is that, if it had it been in chronological order, it would have implied some progress. And some of our assumptions of translation are that the new always replaces the old, that somehow we evolve. So it's sort of unsettling, that assumption about translation that a lot of people have. She doesn't organize it by the last, alphabetically by the last name of the translator. So translator, the person of the translator is not what's important, but she orders this, as you can see, is alphabetically by the text itself. We begin with the A's, along, at the midpoint, half over, halfway along again, and so on and so forth. So underscoring both the differences in these takes on this classic poem, and the translation itself is what matters, not who translated it. The last thing, I hope I haven't gone on too long. Oh God, I probably have. I'll stop there, and maybe we can take some questions. Sorry, I didn't.
Sure. Well, thank you both so much for really a wonderful glimpse into your teaching practices. And we've had some really nice comments coming in from our viewers. We have a wonderful comment from Spiros, who is saying he loves this so much, groundbreaking methods and projects. And from Jacqueline Toon saying, both of you, such fascinating, relevant processes. I love the idea of Will bringing the Madonna and child back down to earth. From Maria Laura Di Tanti, she's responding to Will's idea, saying, I choose the or. And Franca Marini is saying, I totally agree with you, Will, much better teacher than educator. So that's an interesting distinction. I'm curious, as you have heard each other's presentations, do you notice some crossovers in terms of your approaches to teaching?
I mean, I'm not sure approaches. Certainly, I mean, what Alan's wonderful students are doing so wonderfully is to reimagine these, say, the Whitman as a how to express a poem by another means, or the energy of that, and suggest certainly the last thing I was saying about or thinking, see it in new ways. Yeah.
To me, I'm not sure, Will, if you use that first, the and, but, or as actually, that to me, you introduced it as a kind of theoretical way that you think about what poetry can do. I mean, as you were sharing that, I was thinking about how might you use that as a teaching tool, right? So, is there a way in which you could have students? I mean, I always go right to like teaching, because that's what I'm not a creative writer myself. But I was thinking, is there a way in which you might have students like look at one of the poems that you shared right just then, and I can see a kind of a heuristic or a way of having students say, all right, which parts of this poem are and, which are but, and which are or, right? Or sort of like how is it doing these different things? As well as, I think one of the kind of approaches I always try to do with teaching poetry, which so many students come to as with trepidation, if not terror, because they find it to be inaccessible or overly pretentious, and sometimes it is. And so, but what I liked about that, the and, but, or, is it's sort of potentially a way to demystify like poetry and kind of help students. Because I really, when I teach poetry, and hopefully those kind of more creative assignments get at that. When I teach poetry, I try to get away from asking students what the poem means. I think that's just too much of a fraught question, and it's one that's ultimately kind of futile. And really asking, what is the poem doing, right? What is it asking us to imagine or to think about? And I think, I think now I'm finally coming to my answer, Lisa, that that and, but, or kind of tool, right, might be a way for students to kind of think about what is the poem doing, and to sort of release them from the expectation that they have to provide for me, the teacher, an explanation of what the poem means. Because I think that's just kind of too silly.
That's a great point, Alan. I mean, that's the usual thing you hear too. I do too, especially when I'm teaching freshmen and sophomores who they have an idea about poetry, and usually the two responses are, I don't get it. I don't get poetry, as if poetry is something you're supposed to just get, which suggests that there's a teaching method to the point of the poem is the message of the poem, what it means, as you're saying, right? And that's terrible, because poems mean lots of different things. And they're not just supposed to be wrung for their meaning. And the other thing, reaction you get is the poem can mean anything. It's whatever I say it is. It's about it. There's a carrot in the poem, and my grandmother used to, feed me carrots, and therefore the poem is about my grandmother. That kind of thinking is too that you have to deal with what's on the page, but the actual words, the language that the writers used. You can't stray too far, but so it's tough. It's really hard to sort of break through that barrier. But that whole notion that it's something that's made, I mean, which I thought came alive in the projects that you were doing with your students to emphasize the madeness of it, the materiality of it.
In fact, we have a comment that's come in from one of our teachers, Jackie June, who's saying, as you're discussing, that this could also be significant in visual arts as well, of course, beyond the creative writing context too. There was also a suggestion that came in, rather than educator or teacher, maybe even facilitator. So that was another suggestion that's come in.
It's too Latin. It's too Latin, Miriam.
Yes, but I know for myself, I find in my teaching work that, from time to time, everyone may need an extra boost to spark either their creative and or critical thinking. I find sometimes people tend to be on opposite sides of the spectrum. Some may be feeling intimidated, overwhelmed, lacking self-confidence, or on the other side, some people are perhaps overly self-confident with their work and not really digging very deep beyond the surface level. Do you find that you tend to have people more on one end, more on the other end, or somewhere in between?
I love that question. Sorry, go ahead, Will.
You go. No, you please.
I mean, it is usually if students are being asked to do creative writing and they're not, like, they haven't signed up for a creative writing class, that's sometimes they need a little bit of a confidence boost. And so one of the things I'm trying to do with these assignments is in kind of education speak, something we call sort of scaffolding. Like, okay, first write this and then do this. And if you need a template, right, this is why we sort of say, here's a previous sort of poem that's doing a similar thing. Maybe use this as an inspiration, or as a first step, try this. I mean, that students need a little bit of a boost, right, to get traction into that. I shouldn't say I never have students who are overly confident. That's not true. I mean, I think one of the pleasures of teaching where I do is that students really dive with relish into some of these projects, and they kind of go overboard, right? Like, I've gotten things like someone created like a soundscape, right? They're like a DJ and made a soundscape in response to an Emily Dickinson poem. And I was like, this is incredible, right, for your own artistic pursuits, but it's not quite responding to the assignment. And so I'm trying to sort of think about, well, how can I make you sort of fit this thing into a little bit into the box? Because I think ultimately in high school, I mean, I am needing to assess them on their understanding. And so I think sometimes I have had students who've kind of used this and it sparked something. It's the spark has fanned into a flame that is just perhaps a little bit bigger than I'd intended. So try to sort of manage that.
Yeah, overly confident students. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's just an overconfidence sometimes when I see it, not necessarily in themselves, but in, again, this having a very specific idea of what it is, whatever but whether it's poetry or photography or I don't have any solution. I think it's just, I mean, with me, with writing, is trying to show students, expose them to a variety of different kinds of art, or of different types of poetry in my case, or fiction.
And I think your prompt of the and, but, or, to me, that's such a great way to really push people to, dig deeper. Don't just be content with and complacent with where you're at in your understanding or in your work, but think about what, the and, the or. I think that those can be really great prompts in many different
I can't take credit.
contexts.
I told you I stole it. I mean, I did steal it, although it wasn't used for creative writing or art. But yeah, it's lovely. I mean, yeah, it's a lovely and simple way, a nice and simple way to think about. Yeah.
Great. Well, we probably should be wrapping up our conversation just in the interest of time. But thank you so much to both of you for joining us and sharing with us this glimpse into your teaching work. And I thank you also to our viewers for joining us and for writing in with your comments. It's been wonderful to have you all with us here today. I'll just mention to our viewers this same time next week, if you can join us, we're continuing this series exploring art and education, critical and creative thinking. Our guest will be Sarah McCanyon, who is an Italian educator coming from Udine with the Più Arte Studio. So we hope you can join us next week for that presentation. And thank you again so much to Will and Alan for sharing your time with us.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so
Will.
much. Thanks, Alan.
Take care. Bye-bye.